I would like to start this next session by acknowledging the traditional lands of the Treaty 6 peoples, as well as the ancestral homelands of our own people, the Métis. My name is Yvonne Pratt, and I am a faculty member at the University of Calgary at the Workland School of Education. I teach teachers, more simply said. So I teach them actually about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. My folks are from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement, and we've heard quite a bit actually from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement folks. So yeah, I'm from that family line. I'm a Poitras. My father was Paul Poitras, my mother Rose Vaillant, and I'm also related to the Kellyos and the Perantos through my ancestral lineage. So we've traced our family roots back to 1640. I'm finding this conference absolutely fascinating because what we're doing in this space is bringing together our community members along with academics, politicians, leaders, our elders who've graced us with their presence here. And to me, this is a really exciting space. I think something that's quite innovative, where we try to bring what we do in the academy into a space where you can start to bring that knowledge back to your communities. So to me, this is absolutely a wonderful, innovative program, and we have many people to thank for that. Chris Anderson, of course, who's our director of the Rupert's Land, was the director. Natalie is now our current director of the Rupert's Land Centre for Métis Research. We have people like Lauren Gladue, who set up the Rupert's Land Institute to be able to birth such entities as the Centre for Métis Research. These things are all very, very important to us as Métis people. Within my own dissertation, I argued for the reclamation of our voice by our own people. And so within my own work, I worked very hard with the Fishing Lake Métis settlement members, with youth and elders, bringing them together to tell stories, contemporary lived stories of what their lives involved. And so when I hear some of the people say, we are mired in the past, that's not so. There are actually academics, such as myself and others around the room, who are doing the very difficult work of navigating both worlds. So, just a shout out to people. We are doing our work, and I consider it a responsibility and a right. Okay, so enough said about me. I also want to acknowledge people like Maria Campbell, who's always been a mentor. She doesn't know it, but influenced me greatly throughout my academic career, and other people in the room who are actually paving the way for us to have our own voices. So with that all said, I can feel that the tenor in the room is sort of rising and that our people are finding their voice, and I actually really celebrate it. And so I'm going to cut myself short here. I know I can go on and on, so I'll just stop because we have these wonderful panelists. But what I'd like to do is, if we could, try to really focus our questions at the end to the panelists. They've actually done some really hard work around what they're bringing into the space today. So if you could focus your questions on what they have given us, that's more of a dialogue. So if we could do that, that would be most appreciated. All right, so today we have the great pleasure of having Brenda Macdougall. We have Mike Evans, so we're actually going out of order from what we have in the biography. Ryan Shackleton will be our second speaker. Mike will follow. And then we have Tracee Mcfeeters. So we're now starting to bridge into our community in the Métis Nation of Alberta and the important role that they play in Métis Registries. So this is actually where we start to really bring it home. Okay, so we've had a lot of the academic scholarly literature, a lot of the science behind our belongingness, but now we're going to start to really bring it home to the individual. So I expect, if I need to, I will bring out my teacher voice. Okay, so if you people get out of hand, expect that. Okay, so just a warning. All right, so that's for the end of the discussion. First of all, we're going to hear from Brenda Macdougall, and I'm just going to read her bio. I don't tend to read things, but I'm going to do it for the purposes of this role. So Brenda Macdougall was appointed the chair of Métis Research at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Macdougall has worked extensively with Métis communities in Saskatchewan, documenting their history. I used a lot of her work in my own. The author of several articles and a book, One of the Family, Métis Culture in 19th Century Northwestern Saskatchewan, in 2010, her work has centered on Métis family and culture. In her new role at the University of Ottawa, Dr. Macdougall has been engaging in a number of research projects related to the history of Métis communities, including the DAD Project, an online resource comprised of transcribed archival material. Her work is well respected within the Academy and should be within our Métis community. Welcome, Brenda Macdougall.
So I'm not really going to address registries per se, but I am going to talk about some of the types of sources we use, which are also very common within the registry structure, to reflect on what they can tell us about what Kim Tallbear identified as our social, material, and now political relationships. So first of all, thank you for letting me speak, for inviting me. I was really honored to listen to everybody speak yesterday, and I mean the panelists as well as all of the people who got up to speak. I think you've given us quite a gift in terms of telling us on-the-ground history. And I also want to say that it's Harry Daniels that brought us together today and yesterday. And I didn't know him personally. I can't count him amongst my friends, but I do feel impacted by the work that he did, as I think all of us do. And so I want to acknowledge him again today as the central force that kind of brought us all into this space. So I really want to talk about studying family structures as a way to understand our way of life. And because of that, I focus really on what I'm calling kinscapes. So if you think of a landscape, then also think about the way that kinship spreads out across that landscape. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in affiliations and alliances. So one of the things that I want to illustrate this with a few examples, a few pointed examples. So we'll start with Louis Riel. And I know that there's a general perception that he is, 1/8 Indian, or the alternative is that he's 7/8 European. When we talk about Riel in those ways, we diminish his connection to us. And these ideas about him are things that don't come from us. They come from traditional historical scholars, white scholars, who have described him in these sorts of blood quantum ways. And if we replicate that dialogue around him, we diminish his connection to us, and we diminish his sacred kinship to us. And Maria Campbell the other day spoke about sacred kinship. And of course, he's probably one of our most sacred of ancestors. And so I want us to start thinking about him in a different way. But before we start thinking about him in a different way, we'll go to a more traditional way. So the way that comes, first, I'm getting ahead of myself, obviously. I'm a little nervous. I always get nervous. I want us to think about the way that we talk about other people, right? So we know that Poundmaker is a Cree chief. Nobody would dispute that information. And in fact, Rob brought that to our attention this morning. It's an incredibly powerful place to describe him. But he has a varied background and experience. His mother was a boulanger. And if anybody knows her actual name in this room, please share it with me. I've spent so much time looking for it. I was texting with Maria the other morning trying to figure this out. But we know that she was a boulanger. We know that she came from the Northwest, probably along the Athabasca River region.
She knows.
Perfect. I will talk to you soon. He's also adopted by Chief Crowfoot of the Blackfoot Confederacy. We could think of him in all sorts of ways that diminish his identity as a Cree chief. But fundamentally, he's a Cree chief. He is a Cree man, and he led a very important movement for Cree people. So if we go back to Louis Riel's immediate family, where this dialogue of his 1/8 Indian ancestry comes from is, of course, his great-grandmother, who is a boucher from, again, along the Athabasca River in northern Saskatchewan. All of his other ancestral lines are French-Canadian. And then he finally marries Marguerite Monet Diet Bellemeur down in the Judith Basin around the St. Peter's Mission in 1882. If we only look at him as an individual within the narrow confines of this immediate family structure, that's where we come to this conclusion of his ancestry. But he, of course, is a part of a much broader social, material, and political culture that comes out of the Red River Valley in particular. So we know who he is. We know he's a political leader. We know that he descends from political leadership. His father, although French-Canadian, integrated himself into the family structure of the Red River Valley and very much became a part of the local community. He defended the free traders at the Sayre trial in 1849. His sister, Sarah, becomes a nun and goes up into the Isle of Cross region. She becomes godmother to half a dozen children born in that community. And so she integrates herself into that local community. Although she's a nun, she still has a place. And I like this map of the Lake Winnipeg watershed when we talk about the Plains Métis in particular. It only speaks to a Plains Métis homeland. But we can start to see sort of the geographic spread that Plains Métis in particular, and there's other geographies that are equally as important. We're just going to look at this particular one and examples from this place. So let's look at Louis Riel's extended family to actually place him within a broader kinscape. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of key things. Two of Riel's siblings married Poitras. So we've got Poitras. So Henriette Riel married Jean-Marie Poitras. Alexander Riel married Elise Poitras. Meanwhile, their other brother, Joseph Riel, marries Eleanor Poitras, who is the niece of Jean-Marie and Elise. Another Poitras brother, Gabriel, who is the brother of Jean-Marie, Elise, and François, marries Isabelle Malter, which makes him the brother-in-law of a woman by the name of Marie Eulalie Malter, which makes him the who is the mother of Marguerite Riel. So there's a connection. There's a distant cousin connection between Louis Riel and his wife, which is very, very common in our families because we're building alliance structures and families fold back in on each other constantly as we move across time and space. So the Richard Poitras that Maria spoke of yesterday, I think, understood his kinship as being a descendant of one of Riel's sisters, and he articulated that kinship when they traveled into communities. And as a consequence, when he said those words to people, they got, I think you said, grub and a place to sleep. So people enact their relationships with each other because you recognize those kinship connections. And these types of marriage patterns are natural and common in our communities historically. They're the patterns that weave us all together and continue to weave us together still. But the connections aren't evident if you just do traditional genealogy, where you're tracing one person back through time. You're only looking at very narrow prospects of who their relationships are. You're looking at bloodlines, and what I want us to think about are common affiliations and expressions of our social, our material, and our political relations, and how our family networks mobilize those relationships. So again, if we go back to the Riel family, we could just focus on Louis as an individual, or we can place him within this much broader political construct, but also a much broader kinscape. He's not an isolated individual. He is well enmeshed within the families of the Plains Métis. And so I want to place him in the context of Gabriel Dumont, who is a short-lived friend in many respects. They come together sometime after, just before 1885. There's no historical archival proof that these two were ever in the same place at the same time prior to about 1882, 1883. It doesn't really matter, right? On the one hand, it doesn't matter because they both were together in 1885. They supported each other. They created a spiritual relationship to one another as brothers and comrades, and they fought for the same political order. But if we look at Dumont's family, and if we just look at Dumont as an individual, again, we kind of narrow who he actually was. So Gabriel Dumont is descended from Isidore Ecopow Dumont and Louise Laframboise. And it's, in my experience, Laframboise women for the Plains Métis are like the linchpin of almost every family. They are embedded somewhere in a lot of those historical relationships. And Louise is just one example of that. But like Riel, we need to place Gabriel in a broader kinship connection than just his immediate family with his brothers and sisters, his parents, and his grandparents. We know that he married Madeline Wilkie. I'm not actually sure if this is a picture of her specifically, but it was identified as a picture of Madeline Wilkie. Madeline Wilkie is the daughter of Jean-Baptiste Wilkie, who was one of the key leaders of Métis Buffalo Hunt Society out of the Pembina region in the early 19th century. He is also patriarch to a number of families that spread across the southern Canada-U.S. border on both the Canadian and the American side. Jean-Baptiste was also incredibly active politically, writing petitions, signing petitions, and all of those petitions went to various locales, including the American government, the Canadian government, American military, and his children enacted the same kinds of political discourse within their particular histories. So when we place Dumont within a broader kinscape that actually starts to look at his extended family structure, we see all of the Laframboise women. We can see the kinds of families that each of his uncles are married into, and of course Gabriel Sr. is the one that is in Alberta here, and most of the people with the Dumont surname or the Dumont lineages come from Gabriel Dumont Sr. Like his niece, Sarah, oh, sorry, that's not his niece. See, it becomes this like confusing network of people. Like Sarah Riel, he becomes a godfather, in this case, to hundreds of Métis and First Nations children. In fact, he was one of the first guys to take the priest around. He was responsible for taking Father LaFlèche through the Alberta region, and as a consequence, he ended up in almost all of the baptismal ceremonies as a godfather. Was he trying to be a Catholic? I would argue that actually what he's doing is he's really effectively mobilizing his own kinship network. He's making sure that he's systematically allied with the right families. As a buffalo hunter, this is what he needs to do. So he is very strategic in the kinds of relationships that he engages in. And that's the other really important part. These are not accidental relationships. These are strategic. These are planned. These are part and part of arranged marriage structures where families are building very unique and functional kinship alliance structures to operate as they can economically, but also to build these political structures and alliances across time and space. So I spent a lot of time trying to see if I could actually put Riel and Dumont in the same family network. I came really close. I got really confused a lot of the time. I had to make a lot of phone calls. I didn't quite get there, but I'm sure that I'm close. And I could go nuts if I try to actually pull this off. But what I do want to show you is that they do exist within the same geographical space that is beyond their activities in Batoche in 1885. So I want to draw your attention to the yellow boxes. These are all of Marguerite Bonnet Belhamer's siblings. So Patrice and Madeline. There are others, but I've highlighted these ones in particular. These women, Madeline and Patrice, are married to Fleury's. The father of the Fleury brothers in green, Louison, Antoine, and then Patrice, are all brothers-in-law or married into the Wilkie family in magenta. Whoops. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong buttons. So Elizabeth Wilkie marries Antoine Henry Fleury, Madeline Wilkie marries Gabriel Dumont, and Agathe Wilkie marries Patrice Fleury. So through the Fleury family, we start to see the Riels and the Dumonts coming together. They are in the same geography at the same time. So Madeline Wilkie, as the daughter of a buffalo hunter, is in the Montana region by the time Riel arrives. She is married to Gabriel Dumont by the time Riel arrives. Did they meet? I don't know. It doesn't matter. They're in the same Kinscape. They're operating within systems of family alliances that they understand and that they mobilize regularly, economically, culturally, spiritually, and eventually in warfare. I'm less interested in many respects as to whether or not I can actually connect them genealogically than I am with the fact that they exist within the same Kinscape. So these, as I said, these kinds of connections are not accidental. They're incredibly deliberate. They're efforts to build alliances, to make families loyal to one another. They're the kind of alliances that Rob spoke of earlier today. But they're also a part of a sacred relationship with one another. These interfamilial connections are complex and challenging, but understanding them is vital. And we've all said this today. We know who we are. We said this yesterday. We know who we are. Of course we know who we are. But we need to stop talking about ourselves in fractions. We need to start talking about ourselves in these kinds of kinship and lineage descent connections. Only then does the phrase, "we know who we are," start to take shape, and it becomes grounded in actions and behaviors. Because how a people behave is the best indication of how they feel, but also what they believe about each other. So I took a couple of other opportunities here to sort of show you how we can show the mobilization of a kinscape. Just going to move on from that. Okay, so if we look at the Battle of Grand Coteau, in the first instance, we have to look at the Battle of Grand Coteau is in 1851. But if we actually start to do the lineages, the people involved in the Battle of Grand Coteau all descend from certain families, and I've highlighted these particular families: the Grants, the McGillises, and the Bottineaus. And you can see the ancestral lineages, maybe of the First Nations women that they were connected with. And these are relatively speculative in the sense that these are what the priests wrote down, or these are what fur traders wrote down. We can trust them to a degree, but we should also be a little skeptical to a degree. Then, if we just go down to the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, is that the right date? 1816 or 17. We can see that the Grants are again mobilized. They are connected still to the McGillises, and the Bottineau connection is still there. And by the time we get to them in 1851 at the Battle of Grand Coteau, we see different kinds of family names popping up, all of them ancestrally connected to the first generations of Grants, McGillises, and Bottineaus. Right? So they're enacting political action over time in the interest of themselves, as opposed to in the interest of other people. So you could isolate Cuthbert Grant Jr. and say that he is the most important person at the Battle of Seven Oaks. But he comes from an intellectual tradition that is much earlier and that is much broader. And it carries forward past him. We can do the same thing if we look at some of the petitions that are signed. I'm aware of about 15 petitions that exist between Michilimackinac, out to the Rocky Mountains. I'm sure there are more. It's just a matter of finding and locating. We all talk about sort of the most famous one in 1874 where the Métis are asking for a reserve just south of Winnipeg, but there are other petitions. This one comes out of Pembina in 1849. Again, we can take it back to the Battle of Seven Oaks, and we can look at some of the core families that were involved at the Battle of Seven Oaks. Azures, and again McGillis's, and now Gladgys and Garriopys. By the time we get to 1849, they are the direct descendants, the people who signed the 1849 petition are direct descendants of the people who fought at the Battle of Seven Oaks. So these are not isolated events. It's not as though families in Red River did something that families in Batoche did differently. This is all part of one long political action that spreads itself across the 19th century. We can probably see these kinds of things in other geographies. I'm just focusing on one in particular, which is a very specific and precise group. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist at other times in other places. I don't know those families well enough to be able to make those kinds of links. And by the way, this is like incredibly time consuming. So anybody who's involved in genealogical research knows that this is years of work. But what I want to leave you with is that you need to connect kinscapes to political action in new ways. So start using those historical sources, which we all know, and start rewriting Canadian history. And so my final thought on this moment is that while none of us are direct descendants in this room of Riel or Dumont in particular, we all claim them as a part of our sacred kinship. And now that we're here today, we're all going to claim Harry Daniels as a part of that kinship as well. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. I think I could have easily listened for another hour. All right, so if you've got questions, make sure you jot them down because we're going to keep them all towards the end. Next, we have Ryan Shackleton, who actually has a flight he's trying to get to. And so we're going to make sure he sort of keeps within the 15 minutes as best we can. So I'll read his biography. And actually, in the spirit of trying to follow the Venerable Daniel Voth, I had a quick peek at Ryan's bio online last night. And it was really interesting because his website begins with the tagline, "History has been kind to me." And I thought, oh my goodness, you're speaking to a room full that has had quite the opposite. So, all right, so I'm just going to quickly read Ryan's bio. So Ryan Shackleton is director of No History, a historical research company based in Ottawa, Ontario. Ryan has worked as a public historian since 2000 and has expertise in Métis and Arctic histories. In 2013, Ryan led the team that produced the Mattawa-Nipissing Historical Research Report. His firm continues to provide genealogical and social network analysis support to Métis organizations in Canada. Ryan sits on the National Council of Public History's Consultants Committee and Library and Archive Canada's Advisory Committee. He's past chair of the Canadian Historical Association's Public History Group, and he's a frequent lecturer at conferences and universities. Welcome to the podium, Ryan Shackleton.
Thanks, everyone. I wish you would have went on to say why history has been kind to me, and part of that is because it's taken me across Canada to work with Aboriginal organizations and kind of share some of the skills that I've developed over the years. And some of those skills were working with the Métis Nation of Alberta and the Métis Nation of Ontario. What I want to talk about today, and 15 minutes isn't a long time to do it, is talk about exactly what Brenda was bringing up, this idea of kinscapes and how we can work within those using big historical data. The first thing I need to say is we're not the first person or first group to start using big historical data. Frank Tuff was doing it with, and collaborators were doing it with the Métis Archival project. And a lot of this social network analysis and kinship analysis. It comes from people like Brenda and Nicole Saint-Onge. It was actually one of their students, Emily Pigeon, who introduced us to it. So just for some context, part of the PALI test is you have to connect to a historic Métis community. How do we define what a historic Métis community is? I'll leave that to your political organizations to come up with that. But what we can do is start picking apart all the historical data, the census records that we know of, birth certificates, death certificates, and don't think of them as one record. Think of them as a variety of different sources of information. So on a census record in 1871, we have maybe your ancestors' name, the fact that what language they spoke, who they were living near, what they did for a living, what religion they were. So we get 10, 15 pieces of information out of that. And then we go to the 1881 census and we add other things, and people's information changes from year to year. So by the end of it, when we go through 30 years of census and script records and stuff, all of a sudden we have 150 pieces of data about an individual. You start applying that to Métis communities that have 1,000 people in them, or 2,000, or 5,000 people, then you have a massive source of information that can be mined and analyzed in a way that can hopefully tell us something about who these communities are. So again, like Brenda mentioned, traditional genealogy is limited. It's great for tracing back to find someone, but it doesn't work with Métis kinship systems. I'm sure everyone in the room has an aunt or an uncle or a cousin that isn't really your blood relative, but they're a person that's been part of your life and grown up and part of your community. So in this, we have a traditional mother, father. They have a daughter. She marries a husband. They have a grandchild. That's a traditional genealogy, and if you go to Ancestry, that's what you end up with. What it doesn't show you is that the godmother was the godmother to both the father and the husband, showing that there was probably family connections there that existed before. Similarly, the witness at both of the weddings was the same person, showing that an ongoing, sustained relationship exists with these people outside of that traditional blood relationship. These are chosen relationships that people have with other people. So this is social network analysis on a very minor scale. It connects all these different people to each other. When using it, it allows us to visualize really large amounts of data and then draw conclusions from it. And it represents the relationships that aren't apparent in a family tree. It's complicated, and I was at a talk where President Chartrand mentioned that he liked to explain things so his mother would understand. So I'm going to try this the way my mother would understand it. Social network analysis, it's complicated, but really think about it as just two things. There's lines and there's circles. The circles are people from history. Every circle represents one person in history, and the line that connects them is a relationship between those two people. So here we have two different types of relationships. The dotted line represents blood relationships, so the relationship a brother and a sister would have, or a parent and a child, and the red line represents a marriage relationship. So that's all that's there. That's all that we need to remember when starting to look at this, people and relationships. How does it work in a group setting? So we have 20 people in the room, and this was actually done the other day when someone stood up and someone else stood up, and I'm your cousin and we're related to this person. And I would have loved to have seen, if we had the time, an exercise in this room to see how people are related to each other. But think about it, if we were to drop into a gym and we have 20 people here, we find out that these two people are connected by marriage, and a line connects them. They have a daughter, the line connects her. These two people are brought into this community because they are the godparents of this person, but they're also the godparents of these two people. These two people are the spouses of those others, and you see how we start connecting through lines and relationships? Now that person is actually the brother to the first lady that we started with, and these three ladies are the sisters to the first man we dealt with. So this is our community. Up here we have 4 people that are completely related, but they're not part of that center community. This is the community that we establish in a kinship network. These other people, they just kind of showed up. There is no connection between them and the main community through kinship. And keep that in mind, because when we're talking about people that are mixed ancestry because their DNA says they are, they're the outliers here. They don't connect to a historic Métis community. This is Jason Madden's family tree, and what it shows is the Calder genealogy. And this is pretty familiar. Everyone, understands this is a descendant approach, so we start with what we call root ancestors, and we travel back down. What it doesn't show is how they relate to other people in their historic community, which is the Treaty 3 region of northwestern Ontario. If we were to look at this family and then start mapping out, like Brenda did with her presentation, their relationships to other families, this is what it looks like in the Treaty 3. They're interconnected through all these different people. We have 7 different Métis root ancestor families that are marrying each other, that are witnessing for each other, that are participating in society and community together. This is another example from northeastern Alberta of some ongoing research we're doing. That's the kinship network of 120 people and 23 families. You can see it's incredibly complicated, and we see family upon family moving together in these kinship networks. So that's 120 people. Our current research in that area has 5,000 people that we've collected documentation on. I don't think it'd be possible to map that. So we use social network analysis. So these are the 4,000 people that we currently have in our social network analysis. And you can see behind the lines or behind the dots, there's little lines connecting everyone. It doesn't tell us anything because it's a mess. But it's once we apply the program that actually draws all these people together, like we had with our little stick figures, it draws them together based on their relationships with each other. And that's what it turns into. So it contracts all these people and shows us some very interesting things in it. One, we have a main clustering here. We have a second big clustering down at the bottom. And these are actually based on the coloring. We can apply the colors to whatever fields we have in our massive database, whether it be location, ethnicity, language. And it shows us that the center cluster is mostly Lac La Biche. We have Vermilion and Edmonton down at the bottom cluster. And then we have the outliers. These are the mixed ancestry people that don't connect into the community. We can't find kinship. They're not participating that we can find in that community. But what's also really interesting are the lines, the relationships that exist between Fort Chipewyan and Fort Vermilion that exist on this map here, showing that they're interconnected, these communities. And while there's close associations based in Lac La Biche, they're not independent of other Métis communities. This is a different map, and this is of the Métis population in Treaty 3. And similarly, this one is colored based on location. We see a strong central cluster here of blue and green, and that's the Rainy River and Rainy Lake area. We have up in the purple section here, that's more Kenora, but what was really interesting is that this part of the family isn't as closely connected to Rainy River and Rainy Lake. And when we start looking at those individual dots and the data that's beside them, we find out that they're in a different economic position than the people in Rainy River and Rainy Lake. And so we can start identifying trends in these populations. This is another example of continuity over time. I've got plenty of time. Continuity over time. So we start in this first map with people in I believe it's 65, and we show the relationships, and then we map them at 1880. And what it's showing is that between 1860 and 1880, these people aren't separating. They aren't marrying out into other populations. They're marrying and having kinship networks within their population, showing that the Métis community stays and moves forward strongly in this. So that's some examples of how we're using social network analysis, and if there was more time, I'd talk about the sources that we use and how we kind of get the data from an archival document to this, which is a huge process. But I want to talk a little bit about mapping. And because I have to leave, I've got my email on here. I invite anyone to, on the last slide, comment or send me an email, hate mail, whatever you want. This is something we're working on because how do you map a mobile people? It's incredibly hard. I know Brenda's been thinking about it for a long time, as probably other people have. This is one of our ideas. You map relationships. So what this represents is not people and where they go, it's the relationships between people in different locations. The thicker the line, the more that the relationship, the more relationships that exist between locations. In this case, if you were to look at this map in 1850, you would see a very thick line right to Red River. This is northwestern Ontario. But this is done in 1891. That we've mapped this. And we see that the community that has come from Red River and has those kinship ties there is starting to develop around this waterway there, Kenora, Dryden, Rainy River, that kind of area. So this is some of the stuff that we're doing. And yeah, I would welcome anyone's kind of comments, Ryan at No History, if you have them. Thank you.
Wow, he finished 3 minutes early. Okay, well, I guess that you're going to be on your way, Ryan.
Yes.
So anybody that wants to ask questions further of Ryan, he's certainly, I think he's included his email.
Should be, yeah.
Yeah, it's probably in the biography, so go ahead and make a note of that. Very interesting stuff. All right. So now we're going to invite to speak Mike Evans. And Mike, actually, I've known Mike for a few years. He was on my examination committee in my dissertation. So I've really gotten to know his work quite well. He does, similar to me, does a digital storytelling approach. And yeah, I'll read really slowly if you need some time to set up. Mike Evans is, he's taught at the University of Northern BC, and he's also taught at the University of Alberta. He then joined the Okanagan University College, which was later named UBC Okanagan, in 2005. His primary research relationships are with people in the Métis community in northern BC, the Métis Nation of BC, the urban Aboriginal community of the Okanagan Valley, and the Kingdom of Tonga in the South Pacific. Dr. Evans has been involved in several community-based research initiatives and in particular has a long-term relationship with the Prince George Métis Elders Society. Together with elders and community leaders in Prince George, he put together a Métis Studies curriculum for UNBC, We Need to Talk, and a number of publications, including What Is It to Be a Métis? A Brief History of the Short Life of the Island Cache in 2004. He's currently working with the Elder Society and other colleagues on a participatory video project. He has worked extensively with colleagues at the MNBC on a number of projects over the last few years. He has supervised graduate students working on urban Aboriginal issues and topics related to community-based Métis history and geography across Western Canada. Please help me welcome Dr. Mike Evans.
Thanks. That's a little bit dated, that bio the video project's done. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that. First, let me say how impressed I was yesterday when I got into the room late, with how many people from communities were in the room. I was really impressed, and it reminded me that I was actually in one of the key nodes of the Métis homeland, and it's been a really eye-opening and invigorating time. I had a pang of terror, I have to confess, because this presentation is a little bit more academic than some of the others that you've heard. I hope you'll bear with me, because I think it gets into a reasonable place. in the end. So first I want to make a series of acknowledgements specifically to the MNBC, the registry staff in particular, and the captains of the hunt, also the Métis Elder Society, and a whole series of co-authors and collaborators, database developers, students, community and university colleagues over the last almost 20 years now who've contributed to the project or the thinking that's got to this final stage. And then finally, I want to acknowledge the community of researchers and colleagues, in particular those attached to the Digital Archives database. And I want to reach out to Brenda and to Nicole Saintonge in particular for pushing that project up the hill. And the reason why it's so important to me it will be evident in a minute. Disclaimers, I'm not speaking for the MNBC, nor do I in any way represent the MNBC. The place where I'm at right now in terms of my thinking is the result of almost 20 years of arguing with people. I'm sure it's been 20 years I've been arguing with Chris. But having said all of that any errors and omissions are mine, and mine alone. Not a lawyer, was asked to speak about Daniels. Thank you, I think. And I want to acknowledge that there are lawyers in the room, and I'm not one of them. I also want to say explicitly here, this is not going to be a surprise, but the MNC definition criteria for Métis is what's being mobilized in this talk. So coming out of that, think about, Daniels, think about what it might mean for Métis registries on the basis of your experience collaborating with those registries. The obvious thing that Daniels brings to mind is the possibility of a national Métis registry. I think that's got to be front of mind for a bunch of folks who are in decision-making positions. So what's the upside of a Métis-controlled interprovincial registry, however that takes shape over the next little while? I want to explore that using some examples of work that we've done in British Columbia, which are now been incorporated into the Digital Archive Database project, specifically the Historical Documents Database, Lives Live West of the Divide, which I'll talk about in a minute, some fur trade journals, which are a little bit marginal to this conversation, and then some participatory video called the MNBC Culture and History DVD, also a little peripheral to the talk, but I wanted to acknowledge it was part of it. I'm not clicking.
Yes, you are.
Now I'm clicking. I'm looking at my thing as I click, thinking I'm moving the image, and that's why nobody's responding to the images I've been showing. Sorry about that. Okay, so I want to talk about databases and their uses, their users. Here, this is Gabriel Legault and Aaron Dolmage, students at the time. That's at the Salmon Arm Métis local, chartered local of the MNBC, teaching community members how to use the various databases that we developed. And those community members, of course, are developing their own genealogies for their own families' purposes. Now, part of the challenge with databases is keeping them current. And for a long time, I thought that one of the ways to do that was through university partnerships. And indeed, the Digital Archive Database project is part of that. But I want to also kind of explore a little bit more about partnership with Métis registries as well. Because indeed, in BC, that's where these databases originally started. Databases are remarkably difficult to keep current because the technologies move so quickly that you can wind up on a platform that no longer works in the space of 5 years. And when that happens, this is what happens. And I'm sure that all of you who work in this space, who use these databases, can think of examples of databases that you thought were really, really helpful that you can no longer access. And indeed, this is what happened to most of the databases that we developed with MNBC in the late 2000s. And indeed, that's one of the reasons I am so grateful for Brenda and Nicole bringing this project together. So a little bit about the historical document database. A lot of the kinds of documents that folks have already referenced here are included in that database. But one of the important elements of the database was that there was an iterative relationship, a reciprocal relationship between the database and the MNBC, where people who were making application as citizens to the MNBC could make the choice to donate their documents from their applications into the database at the same time as the database was being populated through various other sorts of historical research. The result of that process over the medium term was a database of historical documents that were relevant to Métis in BC, and of course, being on the margins, the edges, if you like, of the historic Métis homeland, that was something that was particularly important for people. These documents are also were helpful in terms of understanding the nature of the historical community in BC and the nature of the connections between that community and the Métis Nation homeland. There were, however, and remain a whole series of issues. Stability of databases is an issue generally. There was some variability in the data document quality and a great deal of range of documents. Unlike something like the script database, there's all kinds of different documents being generated and juxtaposed into these databases. There was also relatively little concern about verification. And by verification here, I don't mean whether the document was genuine. I mean what exactly the document's connection to the Métis Nation might be, even though it was clearly connected to a human being who was somehow positing that they were connected to the historic Métis Nation. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And then there's also, and always and everywhere, and this is true for all databases, including the script database, there's problems and challenges around interpretation. Okay, so here's an image of the database as it existed around 2010 before it collapsed because of a hack. And it's basically a heat map which shows the density of documents that are actually geolocated. And there was a search engine, which you could use a relational search technique. So you had basically geography as one of the main key indexes for the documents, and then they were all coded by subject and patronym. So Métis patronym was one of the key elements through which you could search. Here's an example of a locational search at Okanagan Mission, where you would have found Tronson, by the way, and the search here specifically generates a whole series of folks that we know to be of mixed ancestry, many of whom are certainly connected to the historic Métis Nation, some of whom were not, and indeed the point there is that interpretation is required. This is a heat map of the search Boucher, using that patronym and the various spellings of that patronym. And as, of course, everybody knows, it's a very common name and a very important family, and maps to various networks that are significant as well. Those are the various spellings. And if you can see here, when we searched the database for that patronym, we got 204 places with 212 or 211 documents referring to Bouchers in some form. There's an additional database, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, called Lives Lived West of the Divide. This is actually the book that we developed out of it. It was by a historian named Bruce Watson, and it actually includes all of the fur trade, everything that known, well, that's probably a large claim, but much of what's known about any fur trader coming west of the Great Divide until 1858. And as you can imagine, there's a great deal of information in there. This is the DADP, and here this is also now a search for Boucher. Now you can see dadp.ok.ubc.ca. For anybody who cares, it's live. You can go and have a look at it. When you search Boucher, you get a whole series of records. A number of the databases in here are archival registries, sacramental registries that have been mounted through the University of Ottawa and the fine work of, again, the folks at the University of Ottawa. But when you search it, if you look at the Lives Lived West of the Divide tab, you're going to get something like 21 examples. This is an example of an individual record for Jean-Baptiste Boucher, who was the first Boucher living at Okanagan Mission. And that is a social network analysis of the Bouchers in central British Columbia, using registry records, godparenthood, kinship connection, occupational co-working, in other words, using the fur trade records to see who was working where and at what time. And it shows a kind of a density of relationships around the Bouchers in central British Columbia. This is another look at this. Actually, again, mapping nodes and networks of relationship in a slightly less sophisticated way than you just saw from No History. It was an earlier version of this, but nonetheless demonstrating those sorts of networks. Now, those analyses and the data on which it is based are actually already published. The data-rich part of that analysis is actually in the Nicole, Brenda, and Carolyn's recent volume. Okay. So, point is that when you use individual genealogies, or more correctly, the records generated from individual genealogies that are mediated through Métis registries, or could be mediated through Métis registries, you can generate a kind of critical mass of data that maps, literally maps community in the interrelationships of that data. In the first instance, we did this in order to facilitate the work of the ministry. Of the registry, but I think that there's a greater potential there, and I think that all three of the first three presentations have actually started to explore some of that. I want to make just a couple of self-critical comments about some of the things that we did. The first is that we did not map the registry donated or the registry linked records on the way into the database. So they just kind of got pushed into the database with a whole bunch of other records. And I think that the potential, if you do in fact systematically connect registry processes to the historical processes, to actually create a constrained set of records, or at least an identifiably constrained set of records that's specific to people who have been accepted as Métis citizens by the MNC, or under the MNC criteria, you get a subset of data which is much tighter and actually starts to resemble the kind of characteristics of something like the script data. And that's not something that we did, which makes our database a little bit messy, but it doesn't need to be. And and again, kind of coming back to my first observation, that Daniels potentiates a national registry, is that if a collectivity were going to undertake such an effort, this might well be the time for that effort to begin. That is to say, to create a kind of interrelated set of relationships between researchers, databases, and registries that facilitated not only registry-related, citizenship-related processes, but historical understandings of the Métis community itself at a fairly finely grained level, both in its boundaries, but also perhaps the capacity to actually map movement of Métis families, Métis networks, Métis communities over time would all be embedded in such an enterprise. Thank you.
fascinating. We really are getting a lot of really wonderful work here. All right, so our fourth panelist is Tracee Mcfeeters, and Tracee comes to us from the Métis Nation of Alberta. She's a sixth-generation Métis woman born in Smithers, BC, from Mcfeeters, Tourangeau, Collins, and Desjardins heritage. Due to her prior employment history with the Métis Nation of Alberta, Tracee was a natural to move into her current role as the Registrar and Director of the Métis Identification Registry. So let's welcome Tracee to the podium.
Can you get this to full screen, or is it one little technical moment?
Okay, does it work with oh yeah, it does. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Tracee Mcfeeters, and I'm the Director of Registry and the Registrar for the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'd like to acknowledge Elmer Ghostkeeper for the elder blessing this morning, and I'd also like to acknowledge some of the Métis Nation of Alberta leadership here with us today. We have Diane Scoville from Lac La Biche, Dan Cardinal from Lac La Biche, Lawrence Gervais from Calgary, our Region 3. I don't think is he still here? And Sylvia Johnson, our President from Region 6, and Carol Ridsdale, our Vice President from Region 6, who is also the Co-Minister of Registry and Governance. As a panelist, I will only be speaking about the administrative function of the Métis Identification and Registry for the Métis Nation of Alberta, and specifically how the M&A registers individuals for membership. A brief history: the Métis Nation of Alberta was established in 1928, and this makes the M&A the oldest Métis organization in Canada. Alberta has the largest Métis population in Canada, which was identified in the 2011 census, with approximately 96,000 individuals self-identifying as Métis. Any permanent resident of Alberta who self-identifies as Métis can apply to become a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, as Métis self-identification is the first step. The mandate of the Métis Nation of Alberta is to be a representative voice on behalf of Métis people in Alberta, and most importantly, promote and facilitate the advancement of Métis people through the pursuit of self-reliance, self-determination, and self-management. Individuals voluntarily and willingly apply for membership through a detailed registration process. More specifically, through this registration process, citizens agree to the M&A bylaws and their mandate as set out in Article 1. Paraphrased, Article 1 states the objective of the Métis Nation of Alberta is to promote the cultural, economic, educational, political, and social development of the Métis in Alberta and Canada, stand as the political representative of all Métis in Alberta, and to promote self-determination and self-government. Promote, pursue, and defend Aboriginal, legal, constitutional, and other rights, re-establish land and resource bases, create awareness of the proud heritage, and promote the history, values, culture, languages, and spiritual traditions, develop prosperity and economic self-sufficiency, promote and ensure participation of elders, women, youth, and persons with disabilities in the educational, political, and social development of the M&A, and negotiate on behalf of the Métis in Alberta a modern-day treaty relationship with the Crown through a land claims agreement or other arrangements as called for and contemplated within the meaning of Section 35(3) of the Constitution Act 1982. In 1991, the Métis Nation of Alberta centralized its registry. Prior to this, individual locals oversaw the registration and membership for their community members. In 2003, at the 75th Annual General Assembly, the national definition was adopted by the voting delegates, and in 2004, the M&A incorporated this definition into the bylaws. Secure barcoded Métis ID cards were designed, with the first card being issued in June of 2006, which officially began the process of re-registering all members based on the new objectively verifiable criteria. Between 2004 and 2013, the Métis Nation of Alberta had a dual card system. However, at the MNA's 85th Annual General Assembly in Cold Lake, the Assembly voted to no longer recognize the old red and white membership cards, given the amount of time that had passed as a transition period to the current card system. All members now meet the objectively verifiable criteria based on the national definition of Métis, consistent with the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Powley. The Métis Nation of Alberta Registry started operating as an enhanced centralized registry in January 2004, at which time the MNA leadership established the registry as a department with its own human and financial resources. Goals and objectives were developed to guide registry management and staff. These goals were the accuracy and reliability of established processes and a high-profile registry that is strictly managed. A twofold vision was developed: to secure lifetime membership entitlement for eligible Métis and to maintain a leadership role in Métis registries across the homeland. To implement this vision, the focus was on understanding what requirements were necessary to ensure a successful registration process. Key items identified were the need for a database, policies, operational procedures, standards of service, and the ongoing training of registry staff. So this flow chart outlines at a high level the steps each application goes through once received at the Métis Nation Registry Office in Edmonton. And applications are received in our office either by walk-ins or mailed-in applications by the individual, and also from our regional and local offices. An intake officer reviews the application to ensure all supporting documents have been provided by the applicant. Then data enters basic information about the individual. The application then moves to a registry agent who reviews the supporting documents and preps the family tree by attaching the required linking birth documents as they pertain to the applicant's ancestry. The family tree package then moves to the Genealogy Research Center, where the genealogist researches and verifies the information and makes the determination that the ancestry is valid. If the ancestry is valid, the tree is then certified. The registrar ensures all aspects of the process are complete by conducting a final quality assurance check. A Métis ID number is assigned and cards are then printed off-site. A letter of welcome and certificate confirming membership are sent to the members along with their Métis ID card. The president's signature appears on all Métis ID cards and certificates. The entire membership process for the Métis Nation Registry is based on the national definition of Métis, which states, Métis means a person who self-identifies as Métis, is distinct from other Aboriginal peoples, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, and who is accepted by the Métis Nation. Proof of historic Métis Nation ancestry is provided in the form of linking birth documents. The genealogist researches the linking birth documents and attaches proof pages to the applicant's family tree. Proof pages include script certificates, marriage, birth, and/or death certificates, census records, and/or church records. Once the historic Métis Nation ancestry has been verified, the genealogist issues a certified family tree, and as an example of what is produced, I've used my own tree. This is a census record that we could include as part of the certified family tree package. And another document that we might use is proof is a script certificate, and in this case, the transcribed certificate issued to an ancestor on the Toronjo line of my ancestry. And this document shows the certificate issued to Lucia Toronjo, born at Isle Cross, and lists both her parents as Métis. The final step in the registration process is signed consent from the applicant to conduct a search of the Indian Registry and/or banned lists. In October of 2015, the M&A Registry began discussions with Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada on a pilot project that would eliminate the paper-based check of the Indian Registry banned list in favor of a secure file exchange between the M&A and INAC. This pilot project went live on February 23, 2016, and currently the Métis Nation of Alberta Registry is the only Métis Nation registry currently using this process. The previous process, which involved INAC manually checking the Indian Registry for each applicant name submitted, took upwards of 6 months to complete. The time required to complete these checks has been significantly reduced, and checks are now done in approximately 2 business days. Service Alberta recognizes the MNA's Métis ID cards as a form of identification for the purpose of accessing services. This recognition legitimizes the processes established and validates the work done in the Métis Nation of Alberta Registry. This next portion is just a brief overview of the database we use to capture and store data gathered from each applicant. This database is very comprehensive, with the focus being on security and confidentiality of the information collected. Each user is assigned a unique user ID and password that determines the level of access the employee has to the database. This is the general registry screen, and again, I'm using my information as an example. And with this screen, staff can see at a glance detailed information about an applicant or member. Each tab contains information specific to the applicant and includes family members, documents to support the application, and events the member has registered for. The database is also used to produce general voters lists for MNA elections and to register members for various MNA events. As of January 15th, 2017, the Métis Nation of Alberta has registered 32,587 Métis citizens. The focus of the Métis Nation Registry has always been on reaching out to the Métis community in the province of Alberta. The MNA Registry is an essential service and continuously looks at ways to improve service delivery. We have expanded the use of the registry to support evidence-informed programs and services, and is also used to support health research and case planning for children and families in care. We are extremely proud of the work we do assisting individuals trace their historic Métis Nation ancestry and become proud members of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'd like to thank Rupert's Land Centre for Métis Research, the conference organizers, and for this opportunity to speak to everyone today. Thank you.
Okay, well, you've got a ton of information now. So I would ask you to gather your thoughts and your questions, and if you'd like to approach the microphones, they're on either side of the room. So we'll just give you a moment. Maybe you want to chat amongst yourselves.
I'd like to ask a couple questions if I could.
Okay.
My name's Don McCarger. I'd like to ask Tracee a question about time. Once when a person does make an application for membership with the MNA, what kind of time frame would his results be given, or her results be given back from the MNA?
Oh, sorry. Mr. McCarger, thank you for that question. So prior to April of last year, we were turning applications around between 4 and 6 months. But as a result of the Daniels case, we have experienced a significant increase in applications coming through the door. And unfortunately, those turnaround times have increased to about 7 to 9 months at this time.
Second question I have for you, Tracee, is there some way through the process when people are making an application, and even past applications, can they be identified not only if they're underneath the Indian Act, which they can be now, as you say, within 2 days, or registered underneath the Indian Act, or can they be identified as being entitled to be underneath the Indian Act? Has the MNA ever looked at that aspect of a membership application? If they could be entitled to be placed under the Indian Act, would it be noted on their file?
No, because we would not be able to determine that. We're going based on the information that they're providing. So I'm trying to.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. So if I come to you and my genealogy on my mother's side is full Cree, and then on my father's side he's white, but my mother could be treaty if she chose to, but she chooses, or I could choose to be Métis, or I could choose to be treaty, but I choose to stay Métis, because there seems to be an overlap in our system here, where there is an entitlement to some Métis individuals that they have a choice. They could become treaty or remain Métis, and quietly they remain Métis, And quietly, they could go treaty also. But is there some way we could identify them through the process that they would have that availability or entitlement to become treaty if they chose?
It's not something that has been explored, and we're relying on the individual applicant. The only thing we can do is check to see if they are currently on a list. And
Underneath
if they're
the
not
Indian Act?
if they're not disclosing that information to us, I don't believe we can ask them that.
Would not the genealogy, wouldn't that to provide and disclose it? We wouldn't have to ask them for it. If I provide my genealogy, my mother's full Cree, I can easily become treaty.
But
I
when
choose-
we're researching the information, we're looking for where that Métis ancestry is. We're not looking to see if there's eligibility for treaty status.
Correct. Do you think we should put that in to our process of identifying Métis? The eligibility of becoming an Indian underneath the Indian Act.
I wouldn't be able to do that. That would be a decision that would be made at a political level, not
Correct,
not
underneath the
through
policy, yeah.
not through my role as the registrar. So
I think it will be up and coming in the next while that will be addressed as a definition of Métis. That's just my opinion, but we'll see what the outcome of that will be in the near future. I was watching as you were going through the procedure. Sorry, this is my last and final question for you, Tracee. I was watching as you were going through the procedure of an application of a new member. And in the application, I never saw where you illustrated that member had to take an oath. At what point in your application do you put this oath before an M&A possible member to take?
and actually I'm not sure why that slide isn't in this particular version of this, because it was. So there is an oath of, it's a statutory declaration that the individual is stating that they do not, to the best of their knowledge, belong on the Indian Registry or a banned list. Is that the question that you're asking, or are you referring?
There's another oath that is in fact in front of the courts at this time. I'll be presenting or dealing with it at 2 p.m. in front of Chief Justice York in the Edmonton courts that was put into place, or on Monday, put in place at the AGM at Métis Crossing last year.
Right, I'm familiar with that. And again,
there's two special resolutions that were put forward, and both of them dealt with membership and oaths that had to be taken by past members that are already past, present, and future members.
Right, and so the notice went out to the current membership by way of notice, I guess, on the website and the various forms of communication. But if you're asking specifically for new members signing up,
Yes.
no, not at this, because it's just not included in the current application package that we are using right now, but it will eventually be incorporated again once I get that authority from the leadership. That's, again, not my call to make, to add it into a...
And I understand that, Tracee, but at this time, this oath, those two special resolutions that deal with membership and oaths are not presented to any new memberships persons to take at this time, as far as your knowledge is concerned.
Right, as far as no, it's not. It's to, or I guess potentially to non-members that are looking at that communication. But if a person walks through the door, the short answer is no, we're not handing them a piece of paper and saying here.
Or anywhere in the process. They don't realize that there's an oath of this substance within the mandate of the M&A at this time that they are taking, because you're not presenting it through this application process at this time.
That's correct. And so I'm not in a position as an employee to even make any comment on that, so I would suggest that you speak with he's our senior executive officer, Aaron Barner. I would suggest speaking with him because, like I said, I'm not qualified to make any comment on whether we are supposed to be doing this at this point.
Okay,
Thank
so
you, Tracee.
I'm just going to step
No,
in
thank you,
here.
Tracee.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I think you're going to see illustrations of hashtag It's Complicated. Okay, that's the new one. It is. It's very complicated. a former colleague and a friend of mine, Walter, I see you've got a question for us.
I do. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you. What a great amount of presentations, really good information. Really liked the presentation on the Métis Kinscape. I was sitting there with my two cousins, and we were looking at our family in a whole different way. And I know this is going to invite more questions and, our family history and where everything is, where we were and where the family connections are and what the future holds for all of us. Mike, really liked your presentation, and as a matter of fact, I got both your pages up on my iPad there. I'm looking forward to diving in and seeing everything else that's there and that kind of information. But it did come to me one question, I guess. The information of our people. There's information in the public domain, and there's other information contained within the registries of the various provincial organizations. And I have a feeling that we have to protect our registry information within the provincial organizations and how that is handled. I deal with the Crown on intermittent basis, and we have discussions, and they pull the information out that they want to hear from us, and don't always, they don't always contextualize it among a whole conversation. I kind of suggested that yesterday, is when they meet with the community, there's a whole bunch of things said, but they condense it down into little pieces. And the risk here is that if our current information, which is contained in the provincial organizations, gets out into the public domain, that all of a sudden governments will use it to their own purposes. And I know that our Métis organizations, that we've got great people, we've got great staff. We need to take steps to make sure our information is secure, and that we use it for purposes that are meant for our people and for the betterment of all of our people. So I wondered if you guys could ask, and maybe if you have any suggestions on how we can handle that would be great.
Thanks. That's a really good point, and I could have and should have made it clearer. So first of all the material on that database, okay, two things. One is there's an internal database at MBC which has everything on it. The database that's publicly accessible has all FOIPable material stripped out of it. Okay, so that's the first thing to know. So there's nothing that would not otherwise be at least possible to access publicly already. The second thing to know is that the database itself, for non-members, in the first iteration of the database for non-members, you could only get a copy of the metadata about the document, not the document itself. So that the details were in fact restricted to citizens of the Métis Nation of British Columbia.
I know what some of those terms are, but if you could use layperson
So,
terms.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So FOIP is Freedom of Information, Protection of Privacy. And so, for example, Brenda's just pushed some useful information across. The information in the DADP, that the Digital Archives Data Project, which has all of those databases in, ends 1906. Ish. Okay, so anything else not available. And now in the MNBC database, even the stuff that is available, to actually get the document, you need to have an appropriate level of access. So you can actually protect sensitive documents by restricting them to particular levels of users, up to and including MNBC authorized researchers. So there are various ways of protecting that data. There's always a tension, though, between trying to use the advantages of open access and having people contribute data and giving data back. And it's one that you negotiate on the basis of political leadership and their decisions.
Thank you.
All right. So if you're stepping up to the mic, if you could introduce yourself, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Jack Boucher. I have two Métis cards. This is a Métis settlement card, so Lisa can't speak on that. I'll put that one away. So my question is regarding this card. the Métis Nation of Alberta card, what would constitute for me to have to give it back to the Métis Nation? Like, what criteria would I have to break, or any rules or laws that I would have to break for me to have this hand it back to the Métis Nation of Alberta?
Currently, the only way that you can, your membership to be terminated, as set out in the bylaws of the Métis Nation of Alberta, is by voluntarily removing yourself from the registry, or for your name to appear on an Indian banned list or the Indian registry.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. My name is Wilford Boley. I'm from the Northwest Territories. I'm proud Métis. Reason I say that is because I got 4 older brothers, 6 sisters, and they're all Treaty Bill C-31, and I'm the only Métis. And the reason why I hang on to that is because my dad was a fiddle player, guitar player, and same with my aunties and my uncles. They're the only band back home that used to play for the dances at Métis gatherings back in the 50s, 40s, but way back. But all that I like to carry on because I play a little bit of fiddle myself now, and I play guitar, and I like to sing. So I carry the stuff on, and there's a reason why I didn't want to sign Bill C-31. And how the government's changed my family. Like I feel kind of left out. You know, like you look at the small community where I'm from, there's not too much people, but everybody knows everyone. And my family now want to get back into the Métis, and they can't because, you know, once you're in Bill C-31, you're stuck in there. So I can't wait for self-government back home. We'll change that. I'll get my family back with me, where they belong, back with the Métis, where they were born Métis, you know? And the government, like I said, changed all that, and we need to really bond together. And what Joe was saying this morning too, I kind of like what he said about, you know, going back to our elders and our teachings, especially me. I've been in a sweat lodge with Joe, and been in a sweat lodge with Marie. You know, this way back in the 80s and early 90s. And I feel more comfortable there than I do going to church. I don't go to church. I mean, I do once in a while, but I don't even know why, because I look around at everybody to see who's going to church, and that's all I do, yeah. You know, I don't know how to pray to God. I don't know, or Jesus. I don't know them, you know. But I know when I'm in a sweat lodge, because I'm back to the earth, you know, where I came from, and that's the thing that makes me feel good. But listening to the researchers and the university professors and everything like that, I'm really, makes me proud to hear what all you guys are doing. And all this information that you're bringing to us people, I'm going to bring that back home, and I'll share that with our people. And I got a lot of information too for them. And with just that, I was happy to be here. Thank you very much, you guys, and going home today. So God bless every one of you, or how they say that in Cree or in the sweat lodge, you know, it's different. But thank you very much, you guys.
Well, on that beautiful note of unity, oh, I see Muriel's coming up, and we got another. Okay, so
don't worry, I won't be long-winded.
All right, because yeah, we're getting into the Métis stuff, and we're really just quickly. Muriel is
quick.
Yeah, she's. If you don't mind, we'll let Muriel go first. Thanks.
Yes, and this is just a quick comment. I believe, and I just want verification. When I put my membership application in and it's verified and so on, you can use it when my relatives apply. You can refer to mine. And that is a very good policy because it helps speed things up. So, and the issue of the kinscapes and all that is very encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you, Muriel. Okay, if we could just keep it really short right before lunch. Thanks.
Okay, Yvonne, I just wanted, when you introduced yourself, you mentioned a name, and I think you might be my cousin. But, so I'm going to be talking to you after. Anyways, I come from the province of Alberta. My name's Kim Bowden. I was actually born here in Alberta, and I'm a descendant of the Calahoos. My mother's a Calahoo. My grandparents were Calahoos. And my Bowden name comes from St. Eustache, Manitoba. And so I have, family members, cousins. I guess we're all cousins. I was at the comedian there, Don Bernstein, last night, and he said we're all cousins. So I thought that was kind of cool. But anyways, I live in Saskatchewan and in Saskatoon. And the issue that, of course, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan has its own struggles. And one of the concerns that had come up with respect to this registry is that they ended up having to close the office, like literally lock down the office. And inside the office was memberships, people's memberships that had signed up for. And my concern is what happened. My understanding is that when the registry was born, with respect to a few years ago, based on a number of issues with the court, it was supposed to be non-political. So the question I have is, can we get this registry issue, get politics out of it, so we're not having to worry about who's looking after who or who can apply for what and that kind of stuff? Can we do that? That's the question I have.
Who wants to take that one on? I think we're always already political. But yeah, Mike, you're pushing it away. Anybody want to respond to that? Nobody. Nope. Nobody wants to respond. Yeah, it's interesting. I think we are always already political. We have no choice. When the government defines who we are, until we can cast away those colonial constraints, I think we are captured in all the complexities and the ambiguities and the contradictions that are the Métis people. So, yeah, that's where we are right now. I think we'll do a lot more together than apart. But how we do that needs to be done in a very respectful manner. So on that note, I can hear stomachs rumbling louder than anybody else speaking. So thank you very much for your participation, and we'll see you this afternoon.